moving on to the speaker. Today, we have the lovely Manasee Desai, who is going to talk about behavioral design for scalable solutions. A round of applause as she comes to stage.
Can I have the clicker? No worries. Is this on? It's on? Talk louder? Okay. Hey. Hi, everybody. I want to thank you for making it all the way. Day 3, 4:30. I appreciate it. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here. Wake you up a little bit. I tried to be thoughtful about making a presentation that's sort of engaging and interactive, and so I'm going to be asking you guys to participate. No cold calling, but I would appreciate it if you shouted out answers when I ask questions. So just to quickly introduce myself. My name is Manasee Desai. I'm a vice president at Ideas 42. I oversee a portfolio of fintech partnerships in a number of countries in Africa and Asia. I work with them to help with issues they have on user take-up and user engagement in their products, which are pretty key issues when you're in a startup. And so this presentation is going to talk about those particular issues and how behavioral design, which I'll define soon, can address them. Can we turn this down a little? Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to start with something easy. Can somebody tell me what's wrong with this design? Right. So it's pretty cool. It's innovative, but it's fundamentally not super functional, right? You pick up the fork, the chain falls. It's not a great design. I'd like to contrast this with the next one. So again, innovative, interesting. Notice it's a odd shape, but the tea will come out of the teapot and should be able to fall into the cup, right? Is there anything potentially wrong with this? Sorry? Yeah, so you can get the tea from the teapot into the cup, but when you go to drink the tea, most likely you'll get hot water in your lap, right? And some smart Alex have come up to me and said, oh no, you turn it this way. No, if you do it this way, you'll probably get hot water in your face, right? So not a great design. But what's interesting about this is that, unlike the first one, the design flaw is not obvious. And actually, this is a very true thing for a lot of tech products, that design flaws, even fatal design flaws, are not super obvious to people. And I think that's actually the place where behavioral science has the most value add in terms of helping people think about product design. So what is behavioral science? I'll tell you, you don't have to answer. Basically, it's the study of human behavior. It's somewhere at the intersection between economics, psychology, cognitive science. And it's actually very useful for thinking about how people take up things, how they engage in things, and reasons why they may not do these things. I work at a place called Ideas 42, which is somewhere between a research think tank, a consulting firm, and an NGO. And so I think we're a research firm in the sense that we are very data-driven, and we pull insights from sort of top academics in these fields to drive how we think about design. We're a consulting firm in that we work with real partners. We work with a variety of government people, tech companies, NGOs on issues they're having. And we're an NGO because we mostly focus on social problems. So the idea behind our design is to improve social outcomes for the people who use the programs or products that we're designing around. So as I kind of mentioned, we work in a variety of domains, from education to health to criminal justice. I particularly work on financial products, and I have to say that this is what we do, but there's so many kind of fascinating, exciting things that behavioral science has been able to offer in the last few years. And so behavioral science has been able to reduce college dropout rates, It's been able to help people increase their savings for retirement. It's been able to prevent murders in some cases, which I'll talk to you about later if you have more interest. We've been able to reduce excessive water usage, and all in ways that are sort of counterintuitive and unexpected, and in issue areas where some of these problems seem relatively intractable. So as I mentioned, we do this with a variety of different people, and it kind of helps build out our skill set in thinking about design and doing it in a wide variety of contexts. We do this around the world. We're in 30 countries at the moment, and this list is continuously growing, and we'd love to work in Malaysia as well. All right, time to wake up again. Quick quiz. I'm going to show you an image on the screen, and I want you to tell me the color of that image as quickly as you can. So let's start with a trial. OK. Faster. Right, so all this is to say is that our brain takes shortcuts. There are different ways that we process things, and sometimes it has suboptimal results that lead us to different conclusions. Here's another one. Can somebody tell me what's potentially wrong with this, although I think I've probably done this? Right, so these people clearly have an intention to exercise, but they have chosen to turn down an immediate opportunity to do so by taking the escalator. What I think is good about these people, they're actually at the gym, right? I'm wondering how many of you have planned to exercise and have not made it to the gym in the past? Show of hands. Okay, like 2 of you, right? Everyone else is always exercising, whatever they say, okay. No. So this is something we call an intention-action gap. So these people have well, maybe not these people. People generally have an intention to go to the gym, and for a variety of reasons, they don't make it, right? So typically how we think about behavior is that people have an intention, and they follow through on that intention. So let's say I have an intention to find an app that helps me with some sort of government paperwork, right? That's my intention. It's good for me to take the action. I benefit from that. But for whatever set of reasons, I may or may not do that, right? And these reasons come from context, they come from perception, that sort of thing. It's a very strange graphic, I think. Yeah, inaction is the lesson. So the reasons why people don't do these things are often biases or psychologies that get in the way. I'm going to kind of oversimplify here to kind of get some points across, but essentially, taking the gym example, people may procrastinate going to the gym. They may think, OK, I'll exercise tomorrow. People may think, OK, to get to the gym in the morning, I have to put aside half an hour to get there. But actually, it takes me 40 minutes to get there. Or it takes me 20 minutes to get dressed, when actually I thought it would take me 5 minutes. And so I might run late. It might be a planning fallacy in how I think about my schedule, which means I may not go to the gym, right? There may actually be a way that I conduct my morning. I have like a routine that I often have, and I, without realizing, don't think to go to the gym. So in areas like this, we employ what we call behavioral design, which is essentially recognizing these what we call behavioral bottlenecks, getting in the way of us meeting our intention-action gaps, and we come up with tools that help design around those problems. The way we do this at Ideas 42 is in a process we call triple DTS. Triple DTS is a great acronym because it has too many letters in it, but somehow we keep showing it to people. But just to give you kind of a quick preview, the first thing we do is we work with whatever partner we're talking to about the problems they're facing. So it could be that I'm talking to an app developer about how people aren't making it through the funnel, right? That there's something getting in the way. And so they'll say, people aren't making it through the funnel because they don't have a photograph to upload on the website. So I'm going to put a camera feature right in the funnel. And it's like, OK, wait, let's take a step back. What do we see in the data? OK, people aren't making it through the funnel. Do we know why they're not making it through the funnel? Maybe that's the reason, maybe it's not. People come to a lot of these things with a set of assumptions that are not always entirely based on data or clear things. And so first step we do is just remove any assumptions from the problem definition and go from there. The next thing we do is we diagnose by taking kind of a step-by-step view of what people do when they go through, let's say, an app experience or a process. And at each step and each point where you have to make a decision, we come up with hypotheses about what behavioral bottlenecks are getting in the way. Once we've developed a set of hypotheses around this, we then follow up with some user interviews and see which ones are actually happening. Once we've identified the actual behavioral bottlenecks, we then come up with designs around those things. And we're not overconfident. We know our designs don't always work, and so we actually always test them to make sure that they're getting around the problem that we're trying to address. Once we've identified things that are really working, we bring them to scale. And that's where we're kind of going next with this. So that's a really long, complicated process. I think you'd agree. Yeah? OK. So why do we use something like that? I'd like some people to tell me things that are white. Snow? Sorry? Paper. Cool. All right. So to give you some examples, you can name things that are food, things that are animals, nature. Do you guys have any others? Rice. I'm sure you've got. I'm sure in your brain you've got some others. This is helpful in the sense that what often happens is people have a diagnosis stuck in their head. They have a solution in mind already. And so when they're trying to think through solutions, it's very difficult for them to get past what they're already sort of thinking about. And so developing a framework and sort of a set of places where people have to think about what could be happening is actually very useful. And it takes us past sort of the suppression of thoughts that we get when we normally brainstorm and have something in mind already. So all of this is to say that behavioral design is something that's very customer-centered. We're thinking about people's psychologies, how people are interacting with things. But it's also kind of drawing a lot from science. We're using data to make sure that we're asking the right question. We're using data to test that our designs are working. And we're pulling in insights from academics and tools that have been tested in other contexts. Now to talk about scale. So when I talk to people about scale, I notice that everyone kind of has a sense of what scale is, but they don't always internalize what that really means. So I think referring to Sriram's talk a couple days ago, if anybody was there, he talks about how your first users are typically like your friends and your family, right? And so these people are not necessarily the average user. These people are your advocates. These are people who are going to sell things for you. These are people who would overlook some problems with your app and keep moving forward, right? And they also, because they're the first people, are the people you design products around, right? And so we have to be careful to make sure that we have a sense of a better sense of who the user is and not be so tied to the kind of first people who are using it. So as you move from having your friends and family use an app to people in your city use an app to people in your state, you kind of get further and further away from understanding the context in which these people are living and how they're thinking about the thing. You also move further away from people who will forgive you for a bad UX, right? Anyway. All of this is to say that scale requires sort of an understanding of diverse populations. This is also kind of where data really matters, right? So arguably, as you're scaling your product from one region to another region, you could do a bunch of user testing. You could fly to that region. You could watch people use it. You could note all the different contexts, like local attributes. But you can't always do that. You're a startup. It's expensive. And also, there's a lot of biases in how you interpret those types of things, right? So often what happens when we do interviews is like the person who's the most charismatic or who says the funniest thing says something and it really sticks in our minds. We're like, oh, this problem is obviously happening with everybody because we're thinking about it a lot. So it's actually very difficult to get a sense of what the sort of true occurrence of things are. We also are prone to thinking of recent feedback and not always correcting for other things. And so in this sense, it's actually very important to look at the data of all your users as you scale and do sort of tests that are blind of assumptions. And so in this particular photo, trying to simulate, you'll have rural people, you'll have older people, you'll have younger people, you'll have people in countries you've never been to or thought about. And people are very interesting, and they do things in ways you will never expect. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you think about what your product is doing and what it's serving. So this is where behavioral design for scale is actually quite interesting. So as I'm sure you guys have realized, as you develop apps or products, you are increasingly competing with lots of other people who are also offering these things. And despite the fact that the number of apps is growing, phones are growing a little bit, but they're not growing that much, right? Real estate on people's phones is finite. And so you have to think a lot about how people are making choices about using your product versus another. I think the typical assumption is that with more options out there, there are actually more possibilities for you to find the app that specifically suits your individual needs. And so actually more choices are better. But what we find is that that's not necessarily true. So I'm going to talk to you guys about jam. It may not make any sense, but come with me on this journey. Sort of an early behavioral science study involved some researchers in California selling jam at a grocery store. And so they had two different scenarios. One was one in which they had 6 jams to offer, different flavors. And another one was where they had 24 jams on offer. And what they found is that the number of people who actually bought jam was 10 times more when they had 6 options than when they had 24 options. So only 3% of people bought them when they saw 24 things there, and 30% bought them when they had 6. Is this 5? There's 5 here. That's OK. What's also interesting is that people, maybe even if they made a decision, weren't necessarily happy with the decision they made. And so we call this choice overload. And the idea is that when you have too many options, sometimes you don't make a choice at all. And sometimes you make a choice that's sort of suboptimal. And so being thoughtful about how your product is being presented and other things, and kind of what choices people are thinking through is kind of important. It's also potentially interesting to think about how your product is distinguished from other things, but that requires good framing and kind of a succinct pitch. I'm sure you've heard this, right? So this is an experiment. What do people think this is? Sorry? Pointless. Yeah, that's true. Pigs can probably endure the rain. That's a great point. Anyone else? What do you think we're selling here? Sorry? You are very bright. This is like one of my pet peeves, that often when people are selling savings products, they show something like this. And I think what's funny to me is I don't know why an umbrella would make you think about saving money, right? And the reason they say they have an umbrella is because it's a rainy day account. It's sort of a jargon term. It's a term that's very specific to certain contexts, right? And the pig is there because, in the US and maybe other places, people have piggy banks when they're little, and they put coins into it and save money over time. And then when they want to spend it, they kill the pig. It seems very painful to me. Maybe that's like a good commitment device, but the idea here, for some reason, is you're keeping your piggy bank dry. But I think it's a good example of something that's like using terms that relate to a product, but kind of over-assuming what people know. And so this is sort of jargony, and we think of it as kind of cursive knowledge. It's like not really understanding why other people may not understand that this is a rainy day savings account. So how do we improve this, right? So we could be a little bit more clear, right? We could say having a rainy day savings account is useful when, let's say, your car breaks down and you can't get to work and you can't make money. So you show a picture of somebody's car breaking down, or you tell people 80% of people endure car trouble on their way to work in whatever time period, right? That's better. It's like maybe speaking more specifically to the thing you're trying to get people to think about, but it's also potentially troubling, right? So there's something we call ostriching, which is a bit complicated, but just generally, if you think about it as people not wanting to deal with information that's troublesome to them, or there's sort of a negative valence. they will put their head in the sand and pretend that that problem is not happening or may not happen. And so showing something that's too extreme may actually deter people from using your product. So though I don't have the best solution, this is potentially something. Maybe you love this umbrella. Maybe rainy day savings is actually something people really know. But here you're kind of showing something that's more clear about what you could use the product for, but also not doing it in a way that's going to turn people off from looking at your thing. OK, the next thing I want to talk about is something we call hassle factors, which I think in tech is referred to as friction. Yeah? This is a FAFSA form, which in the US is a form that you fill out when you're a college student to get free aid from the US government to go to school. I think in a past presentation, I handed out FAFSA forms, 24 pages. I'm sure this is like very clear to you. There's lots of words. It's very confusing. Filling out this form actually requires a lot of steps, and it requires a lot of information. And you can imagine that something like this is actually like a really good target for an app, right? That simplifying this process, not having this paper and moving everything around is something that would be a lot easier on an app. But what's tricky about this is you still need all that information to apply for this, right? And so if you imagine creating an app that simplifies this, you still have to walk people through getting all that information in there, right? And so what often happens in this particular case is that people don't plan well around how much time it takes. And so there's actually a priority deadline to submit this application by which you get much more money than if you did it later. And most people don't do it by the priority deadline. They have planning fallacy, and they think, oh, it'll take X amount of time, or they're not aware of the deadline enough because it's hidden in this kind of jumble of stuff. And so the application isn't filed. Similarly, you can imagine, you open my app for this, and you're like, I've just done 5 questions, and I'm bored, and I don't know what my parents' tax return is, and I don't know how to go forward, and then you never open the app again, or you do it later, and you're in trouble, right? So a way that we kind of get over this is something we call chunking, simplifying things, and so just breaking things into smaller, more manageable pieces. We also do things like reminders at different stages along the process before the deadline. And so in a particular design we had for the FAFSA forum, students were getting an email once to remind them of the deadline before the thing was due. And so what we actually did is send a series of 8 emails, either just to students or just to parents or both to students and parents, to see if this would improve application filing by this priority deadline. And it did, and it did a great job. And what's kind of profound about this is not that we're reminding people making something shorter. Maybe that's obvious to other folks, but it's a very cheap intervention. It's sending 7 emails more than you did before. And it had a huge impact on these people. So people got financial aid. They got more money than they would have gotten, which means people could go to school, which means people would have less debt if they went to school. And so you can imagine kind of a profound capacity of both tech and behavioral science to kind of come up with solutions to things like this in a very cheap, easy way. Behavioral science is often something people think about with marketing, psychology and marketing. It's not all marketing. Getting somebody to use your product is not all marketing, but marketing still helps, right? What's interesting is we have all these different ways of thinking about framing or talking about the message, right? So there's something called loss aversion, where people are afraid of losing out. FOMO is kind of a similar thing, right? So I'm sure you've seen stuff like this, like don't miss out. Don't miss out on whatever FAFSA application. Social norms is something where you talk about different versions, but you could talk about what other people are doing. So millions of Malaysians are using the FAFSA app. And then you might add, don't miss out, right? Let's double it up. It's very cheap. Then there's status quo bias, which is like people have a very specific way of doing something, and they need a bit of coaching about thinking about doing it a different way. Finally, the last thing that I think is important that people don't really understand is that trust is really important. It's especially important when you're kind of a new startup and you don't have name recognition yet, right? Especially if you have some silly name. Just imagine, right? So I showed you a photo of these like older people or these people in another country, and your app is called FAFSA is awesome or something, and what is this? FAFSA is a weird example for that, but like, imagine it's a financial product, right? Building trust with the population is really important. So even if somebody downloads something, that doesn't mean that they're going to use it. And it also doesn't mean they're going to use it kind of in a way that's meaningful to your product, right? And so ways that people get around this and building trust is either in messaging, establishing some kind of reciprocity with the customer, but also things like just having receipts. Like, so every time I do something, you get an SMS with a receipt, or every time you check your bank account. So there's a lot of stuff where people will get a new financial app and check their bank account over and over for a period of time. And they'll do that just to make sure their money is still there and if it's moving around. And so after a period of time of checking whether the money is there and making sure they have trust in it, then they start using it in a way that's like profitable to the partner. And so trust is like a really key kind of part of all of this, especially when dealing with people's income, right? Who are you? Why are you here? Are you going to lose my money? How would I find you later? These are all real questions, right? I'll go through this a bit quickly, but in general, you want to make sure that you are not just engaging people once, but that you're retaining them. Not only that you're retaining them, but that they're using the product in a way that's useful to you. So either they're using it in a way that makes profit for you, or they're using it in a way that creates content that drives other users or something like that. And so you want to be thoughtful about keeping that experience going in that direction. So some strategies around this are habit formation. I'm sure you guys have thought about this with gamification, that sort of thing. Crafted reminders. So it's one thing to sort of remind somebody about something, but it's much more powerful to do it at the right time and with the right message, right? So if I'm trying to get you to save your money, if you get that message when it's like Friday night and you're out partying with your friends, then you're less likely to save money, I think, than if you get a message when you've just gotten paid and you're feeling flush and you have this opportunity to put some money in a savings account. And so even though reminders, I think, are very intuitive to people, it's kind of a nuanced thing, right? And you don't want to remind people so much that they start ignoring you. Finally, progress bars. I'm sure you guys have seen these. They sort of establish the studies that show that seeing if, let's say, a website or an app is taking a long time to load, if you're transparent about what's happening while the person is waiting, then people are more likely to stay engaged in the product, right? So this is building the thing I was talking about before. Reciprocity is like you see that the product is working for you, and so you'll work for it by waiting longer to engage with it than you might normally if you didn't see that. So all of this is to say that behavioral science is very useful for tech products, but it's useful for all sorts of things. People use it for weight loss. People use it for attaining goals. You can imagine behavioral science also applying to like your more general startup processes, right? So if you have planning fallacy and you underestimate how long something will take, it could have huge implications for your startup, right? If you're ostriching because you don't want to deal with something negative, it could also have huge implications for your startup. Chunking is very useful in one of those cases. That's a very dramatic graphic, I just realized. Thought he was jumping over. Potentially having some problem. But yeah, I mean, behavioral science is something you can apply in all sorts of settings. So we've talked about scale. It's really important to think about the fact that the more you're scaling, the less you know about the population. And the more sort of susceptible you are to making assumptions about why certain things are happening or not happening on your product. So for this, something we've done a lot in the past is A/B testing, which at its face is just comparing version A of something to version B of something and seeing which one works better. We encourage a lot of our partners to do this in a randomized way. And randomization is a bit complicated, but basically what it does is, if you think of it as like a treatment and a control group, it sort of puts a random set of people in each group and does it in such a way that you know that whatever difference you see in how those people behave is directly attributable to that thing that you changed between the two options. And so it removes a lot of the biases that come with kind of evaluating your product, right? So if you're evaluating your product with your family and friends, how much they use it is very dependent on how much they care about you, right? It's a biased sample, right? If you're doing it in a city where let's say you're selling flood insurance and it just flooded last week. If you see people using your product in a way that's like remarkable, maybe it's not your product, maybe it's the fact that there was just a flood, right? And these things are all kind of unpredictable as you get further and further out. And so it's important to have diverse testing groups and to do randomization with this. Just talked about this, but basically, yeah, when you're talking to people, the things that stick in your mind are not often the things that are actually happening. So in summary, behavioral insights can uncover kind of subtle and visible barriers to how your product is growing that are not immediately intuitive. Very low-cost design changes can have a big impact on how well your product does and are worth investing in. These could be messages, these could be changes in your digital interface, they could be changes in the process of how people get to the app. And that, a lot of this is accomplished through behavioral diagnosis and rigorous testing. And this is something that helps you both get in touch with how your product is being used and helps you stay connected to your populations that you're serving. Finally, if you're at all excited by behavioral science and you don't like reading academic journals, we launched a website called the B-Hub. And it has a bunch of summaries of places where behavioral tools have been applied in health, education, finance, in countries all over the world. There's also, in the Optimize My Approach section, a checklist, very quick checklist of ways you can optimize things like emails or processes and that sort of thing. And it just gives you very quick guidance on how to do it. We have B-Hub users from all over the world, including Malaysia. We're going to put in a discussion forum soon so that people can talk about this stuff and how to apply it. We encourage you to come to our website and learn a little more about behavioral science as well. And thank you.
Yes. Okay, Mike. All right, we're going to open up the floor for Q&A. We're just going to have about 3 questions. Anyone who has a question to ask? Feel free, ladies and gents. I'll pass the mic on to you guys. There we go.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you have any books or other resources that you can go into behavioral science and stuff, just in case you want to dive deeper into the whole field or something. Do you have any recommendations? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of popular books out there. Nudge is very popular. There's Predictably Irrational. I don't know if you've heard of that, but they're books that kind of talk about a lot of these things and go into more detail about how the original experiments were done. And they're written quite, Predictably Irrational is actually one of my favorites. It's written very well and clearly. One of our founders, or 2 of our founders, wrote a book called Scarcity, which is about thinking about all of this within low-income populations internationally. And that talks a lot about how people who are don't have a lot of money or don't have a lot of time make decisions and how they kind of see the world, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to, sorry, I just wanted to ask, could you share with us maybe one of the most difficult behavioral tests or observations that you've done and how you tackled it?
Sure. It's difficult. So I think I'll tell you what's probably the most difficult that I don't necessarily have a solution to, and then maybe I'll come up with something else in the process. So there's a lot of behavioral stuff going on with things like racism, discrimination, gender discrimination, that sort of thing. And it has a lot to do with how we think about people based on previous experiences or based on other things. And those are very difficult to overcome with behavioral tools. But I'm optimistic we'll come up with some things because I think this field is young, but it's growing very quickly. Something we did that was very interesting is we were working with a college in San Francisco, and they had a very high dropout rate among a certain population of students. And we were trying to figure out how do we keep these people engaged in school and keep them going, because usually what happens is if you start school and you drop out, you've now taken on a bunch of debt, and then you are unable to pay that debt in the way you would have had you finished your degree, right? You make much more money if you graduate. So the sad truth is that if you start college and you don't finish, you're both highly indebted and not in a great position to pay it off. So we're quite focused on keeping people in school for a variety of reasons. And a very interesting solution we came up with was just a simple video of sophomores, second-year students, talking about their experiences in college their first year. And they just kind of listed all the problems they had. They said, oh, you know, I feel like I don't have my friend circle here. The weather is strange. I feel like everybody else is smarter than me. I am like having trouble managing my time, whatever else. And then they talk about how they've sort of persisted. And that had a big impact. People recognized they weren't alone in the feelings they were having. And that kind of helped push them past having those reservations that might normally keep them back, especially if they were maybe the first person in their family to go to college and they didn't have people to talk to about it. And so we saw that among that particular set of students that were prone to dropping out, we were able to lower the dropout rate quite a bit. So.
Hi, Desai. My name is Fauzi. I teach at a local university. Now, concerning what you're doing, I think it's very interesting because my area itself, I call it as the human side and trying to understand human. And listening to whatever that you're doing, there's so many questions that I would like to ask you. For example, how do you validate your results? You know, how do you actually make sure that people are convinced with whatever that you're doing, especially when you talk about different contexts? And then how do you actually because when you talk about a certain context, as you're saying, certain experiments, for example, would not work in a certain context.
Yeah.
You have to go really deep. In a PhD, you're going to take years for you to get the results.
Yeah.
For example, you showed just now the piggy bank and the umbrella. In Malaysia, pig is something sensitive, for example, to the Muslims.
Yeah.
That is very much related to, you know, the context. So I've got all these questions. So how do you validate all your results, and how do you find the results in I'm sure it's in a short period of time.
Yeah,
Yep.
those
Thank
are great
you.
questions. No, and I think they touch on something that I didn't maybe emphasize enough, which is context really matters. So I think we're not trying to fool ourselves to believe that these behavioral biases that we've identified are happening universally to everybody, right? And so I work in a lot of different countries with very different settings, with very different sensitivities that I could never expect, right? And so we're quite thoughtful about, in that sort of behavioral mapping process I mentioned, really understanding kind of what's happening on the ground, walking. It takes a few hours, but it's only a few hours. Like walking step by step through what does this person have to? They have to get a phone. They have to go bring their ID and go to this place and get the SIM card, and then they're on the thing and it crashes or connectivity fails or whatever. Kind of going through all these things. What are the sensitivities that people might have? So there's definitely a feeling among certain communities that money needs to keep moving, right? So if you're trying to tell people to save, and they're like, no, if my money is not moving, then it's not doing anything. That's like a very bizarre kind of way of talking to them, right? And it's a rational thing. It's not because they need to be paternalistically told that they should save. It's because places like that sometimes have very high inflation. So saving money is actually not a smart thing to do, right? You kind of have to keep it moving. So that's kind of why we spend a lot of time in diagnosis and trying to figure out what the bottlenecks are. And we try to validate results doing a set of interviews. We do as many interviews as we need to make sure that whatever behavioral hypotheses we've come up with are actually happening on the ground. And we try really hard to remove our own biases about who's like the most interesting, who talk to us. And then to validate things, we do these randomized control trials, which are drawing from kind of how pharmaceutical drug trials go, and trying to really isolate what is like, this thing that we did is causing this thing to happen. Of course, you can do that for one time in one setting. It doesn't mean it's going to work all the time in every setting. And so part of our scaling process is to keep testing each time and identify different contexts where it doesn't work, understand. Sometimes it's not just like you test it and it doesn't work. It's like you notice there's something about the process that didn't work well. And so even if it's like not the statistical result, it's like, oh, people's switch SIM cards. So like sending out an SMS campaign is not useful because you don't know when they're going to get it, right? So I think it's sort of this thoughtful, iterative testing that we do that kind of keeps us as close as we can. But of course, we're not universally applying anything, although we are trying to kind of understand these things better.
All right, I think we will close the Q&A. But for all those who still have questions, please feel free to visit Ms. Manasee just by the side here and ask all the questions. It's 5:15 and our next session starts in the next 10 minutes. We're going to be having Lucas Nu, who's going to be speaking about from local to regional, how to tap into Southeast Asia's potential to scale your startup. But before we leave, another round of applause for Manasee, please.